History often turns on moments no one expects. Battles fought far from great capitals. Clashes forgotten by most, yet decisive enough to shift the fate of entire empires. Today's story takes us to one of those overlooked turning points. A last desperate charge on the edge of the Polish frontier, where an aging raiding empire made one final attempt to prove it still mattered, and where a much smaller Polish force refused to yield. What happened there did more than protect a border. It quietly closed the door on centuries of Ottoman expansion. 30,000 Tatar horsemen thundered across the steppe, rolling toward the Polish border like a storm front dragging dust and wind with it. On parchment, it shouldn't have even been a contest. The Tatars outnumbered the Polish troops by more than 4-1. By every reasonable measure, the Commonwealth should have collapsed under that tide of cavalry. But the world doesn't always follow the logic scribbled in military reports. Most remember this clash as just another raid on the frontier. In reality, it became the final echo of the steppe raiders' long dominance, the moment when centuries of Ottoman-backed pressure into Europe finally met its quiet end. So today we ask a simple question. What allowed 7,000 men to hold the line where armies twice their strength had buckled? Was it fortune, command, or perhaps an older, nearly forgotten craft of war that tipped the scales? And how did this single victory close the last chapter of Ottoman advance? You probably recall the date September 12, 1683, in the fields outside Vienna, where King Jan III Sobieski of Poland led a bold relief attack that shattered the Ottoman siege, threatening the Habsburg capital. That triumph became the turning point, the day the Ottoman push into Central Europe stalled for good. In the wake of that victory, the Holy League was born, a united front linking the Habsburgs, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Venice, and later Russia, each determined to drive the Ottomans back. Sobieski didn't pause after Vienna. He marched with the Allied armies deeper into Hungary, claiming another major victory near Buda. Still, the campaign wasn't flawless. A Polish vanguard, essentially the scouting detachment, had already been wiped out earlier at Pascani. Even so, Sobieski pressed on. The Commonwealth joined joint operations aimed at containing the Ottomans, blockading strategic fortresses like Kamenik, which had stayed under Ottoman control since 1672, and even launching expeditions into Moldavia around 1691. Yet the grand objective, retaking Podolia, the rich southeastern province lost decades earlier, remained unattained. The Holy League was gaining momentum overall, but the Polish front never delivered that one decisive blow everyone hoped for. By the late 1690s, exhaustion hung over Europe. Austria, Poland, the Ottoman Empire, every power was drained of silver, soldiers, and patience. Diplomats were already drafting the peace terms that would become the Treaty of Karlowitz. And here's the key. In any peace deal, the side holding the ground gets to shape the map. That's why the clash at Podhajce carried such enormous weight. Poland needed a final, undeniable success to prove control of its frontier. The Ottomans and their Crimean Tatar allies needed to show they still had teeth. While diplomats prepared ink and parchment, these two sides prepared for one last fight, each hoping to reach the negotiating table with a stronger hand. The Crimean Khanate, long aligned with the Ottomans, had motives that went far beyond politics. Their economy depended on something grim but central to their world, the slave-raiding system known as Jazer. For centuries, from roughly 1441 well into the 1700s, the Crimean Tatars rode north and west into the contested borderlands of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, carrying off captives by the tens of thousands. Those people were sold in Ottoman markets from Istanbul to Anatolia. Some years saw so many captives brought south that the slave markets were glutted, prices dropping from sheer supply. That's how essential Jazer was to the Tatar state. By 1698, the Holy League's victories and the looming peace treaty spelled disaster for this raiding economy. Once the treaty was signed, the old hunting grounds in Poland and Ukraine would effectively close. So the Crimean Khan of that moment, Kaplan I Giri, chose to gamble everything. He gathered what strength remained, around 30,000 mounted warriors, and rode north, hoping for one last massive raid before the borders froze for good. But the world had changed. The Ottoman Empire, the Tatars' longtime patron, was preoccupied with the Russians at Azov. That meant no janissaries, no heavy artillery, no steady supply caravans from Istanbul. This would be a purely Crimean affair, smaller and far poorer than the mighty coalitions that once swept through Podolia a generation earlier. Still, the Tatars relied on what had always been their greatest weapon: speed. These riders practically lived in the saddle. Each man carried a composite bow, a curved saber, and sometimes a matchlock musket. Yet mobility, not firepower, was their true strength. They couldn't storm stone fortresses, but they could cover more ground in a day than most European armies could in 3. Their strategy was classic: strike deep, grab what you can, and fade into the horizon before the Commonwealth could catch up. This raid was more than plunder. It was a last attempt to keep a centuries-old system alive. Kaplan rode at the center of his host, surrounded by his elite guard, the Orda, the command corps, and final reserve. From this central node, orders spread across the field through twisting banners and the deep, rolling thunder of Nag-era war drums. It was a system refined over generations, allowing a Khan to steer tens of thousands of riders scattered across miles of open grass. But don't imagine a tight, compact army. The Tatar center remained intentionally thin, like a bow pulled taut, ready to release. Their preferred formation was an open crescent, space left between riders so they could bend, retreat, or flare outward in an instant. This crescent was the hallmark of Tatar warfare, a masterpiece of step tactics perfected over centuries. Then came the wings, the true striking force. On each side of the crescent rode thousands of light horsemen drawn from various tribal clans: Nogai, Biak, Edisan, and others scattered across the steppe. These were masters of hit-and-run combat, men trained since childhood to ride fast, loose arrows with precision, and melt away before the enemy could strike back. Around 7,000 Polish soldiers gathered near the frontier town of Podhajce, staring down a Tatar force that dwarfed them several times over. At their head stood Grand Hetman Feliks Kazimierz Potocki, a commander often hidden in the shadow of more famous figures like King Jan III Sobieski, the hero of Vienna in 1683 and the man who had shattered a massive Tatar assault near Lwów in 1695. But for this battle, it was Potocki who held the fate of the region in his hands. And what he commanded might surprise you. The Polish army at Podhajce was no longer the all-cavalry juggernaut of the winged Hussar Golden Age. It was something far more modern, a hybrid fighting force, carefully balanced between heavy horsemen, disciplined foot soldiers, agile dragoons, and a compact but deadly artillery corps. Infantry formed the backbone. Roughly 3/4 of the foot soldiers were foreign-style units, drilled and equipped according to the best Western European methods. Many carried Dutch muskets or long pikes, usually with 2 muskets for every pike in the ranks. By the 1690s, many of them were already transitioning to flintlock muskets with bayonets, cutting-edge weapons that allowed faster firing and the ability to fight hand-to-hand without switching tools. Then came the dragoons, about 20% of the army. These were soldiers who blurred the line between cavalry and infantry. They covered ground quickly on horseback, but dismounted to fight. Light muskets, curved sabers, even compact axes, tools as useful for digging defenses as for combat, hung from their belts. Their task was simple and vital: fill gaps, protect the cannons, and reinforce any point where the line began to bend. The cavalry still carried weight and prestige. The famed winged hussars, now about 20% of the mounted arm, served not as shock troops charging with reckless glory, but as a strategic reserve, unleashed only when the moment demanded decisive force. Alongside their famous lances, they now carried pistols and carbines, evidence that warfare was shifting toward mobility and fire. Supporting them were the panzerni, roughly 60% of the cavalry, medium-armored horsemen who prized versatility. Spears, sabers, and composite bows hung at their sides. They could switch between close and range combat at will, making them the workhorses of the mounted arm. Finally, there was the artillery. No massive siege guns, nothing like the firepower of earlier Polish wars, yet the pieces they had were expertly handled and exceptionally well guarded. Potocki made one crucial improvement. He assigned dedicated infantry and dragoon detachments to protect the guns at all times. That meant the cannons could keep firing even when the fast-moving Tatar cavalry swirled around the flanks. Taken together, Potocki's army wasn't built for glorious cavalry charges. It was built for disciplined defense. After years of suffering under steppe raids, the Poles had learned a painful truth. Bravery alone couldn't stop a horse archer onslaught. But firepower, earthworks, and coordination could. It's why historians often call Podhajce a perfect example of the spear and gun principle, Western discipline and gunpowder overcoming Eastern mobility and surprise. Put simply, guns and shovels beat bows and sabers. Even the army structure told the same story. With 3/4 of the infantry trained in Western fashion, Poland had fully embraced European tactics. Strong dragoon support meant speed where it mattered. Artillery protection meant no cannon would ever be left exposed again. Now let's look at where all of this unfolded. Podhajce sat among a maze of woods, streams, ponds, and small hills, a landscape that made cavalry maneuvers difficult and dangerous. Potocki chose his ground carefully. He camped just outside the town, using natural and man-made features to turn the area into a fortress without walls. Dense forests guarded the west, blocking any sweeping flanking attempts. Open ground stretched to the east, perfect for exposing fast Tatar cavalry to musket and cannon fire. But the true genius lay in the center. Ponds, streams, and old earthworks near the ruined castle were woven directly into Potocki's defensive line. Behind the main formation sat the Tabor, a wagon fortress. Dozens of wagons were chained together in a tight square or polygon, forming a movable barricade of wood, ironwork, and gun barrels. Inside, infantry and artillery found shelter. Musketeers fired through gaps between the wagons, while cannons blasted from protected angles. These weren't heavy siege guns. Poland favored light, maneuverable pieces ideal for tearing into charging horsemen long before they reached the line. When the Tatars approached, the musketry began. Smoke rolled across the plains. Cannon blasts echoed off the hills. And suddenly, the battlefield flipped. The Tatars' composite bows, deadly at close range, could reach only about 150 meters. Polish muskets and light cannon hit from twice that distance. The Tabor forced the Tatars to fight at a range where their arrows meant little. They were kept far enough away to survive, but too far to kill. French engineer Guillaume Levasseur de Beauplan, who studied Eastern warfare for years, noted that even a small number of Cossacks inside a Tabor could withstand thousands of Tatars simply because the raiders could never get close enough to make their arrows count. The Poles had used this method before. Sobieski himself employed it at Podhajce in 1667 against Cossack Tatar forces. But in 1698, this old system had been modernized. More firepower, better coordination, a more professional army. It's early September 1698. The Polish army, stretched thin after long marches, is trundling north from Monastirzyska. The entire column winds nearly 9 kilometers. That's about 5.5 miles of soldiers, wagons, cavalry, and cannon stretching as far as the eye can see. Behind them, a massive Tatar force, part of the Crimean Khanate's raiding army, is closing fast. On September 8th, the storm finally hits. A second Tatar column, swift and powerful, loops around and slams into the rear of the Polish march, the weakest point of any army on the move. Normally, such a strike would shatter a marching force. But the Polish commanders knew the Tatars' playbook. Near a small village called Wierzbos, they halted the column and ordered an immediate tabor formation. The wagon fortress, reinforced by carefully placed artillery and a landscape of streams and ridges, brought the Tatar attack to a dead stop. The horsemen, usually unstoppable on open fields, found themselves staring at walls of wood and steel backed by cannon fire. Where they expected confusion, they found discipline. Where they hoped for panic, they met preparation. Not only did the Poles hold their ground, they managed to fall back in good order and join the main defensive position waiting at Podhajce. Those Tatar riders, masters of quick raids and encirclement, were now forced into the one thing their army was never designed to do: a frontal assault. September 9th dawned with the moment everyone had been bracing for, the day of the main battle. Kaplan-Giri made his choice. He would throw his full weight into a decisive attack. His scouts had spotted what looked like the Polish weak point, a narrow dam near the castle, one of the few places where riders could cross the river quickly. Break through there, and the entire Polish defensive system might unravel. At first, the numbers seemed to be on the Tatar side. Wave after wave of mounted raiders surged forward, pressing the Polish defenders so hard that some units were forced to fall back. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Tatars might break the line. But then the thunder began. Polish artillery from the old castle and from earthworks built nearby erupted into a coordinated storm of fire. Cannon shot tore into the attacking ranks with frightening accuracy. Horses bucked and collapsed. Riders scattered as explosions ripped into the advancing formations. What had looked like momentum suddenly twisted into confusion. And that's the moment Potocki had been waiting for. His cavalry reserve, likely a mix of panzerni, armored lancers, and a handful of surviving hussars, surged forward under the command of Mikołaj Potocki. This wasn't the romanticized, open-field charge of 17th century legend. By 1698, Polish cavalry acted as the hammer, held back until the enemy was already unbalanced. They slammed straight into the disordered Tatar front, and the raiders were forced to pull away. But Kaplan-Giri wasn't ready to concede the field. He shifted tactics. Rather than another frontal assault, he sent a large detachment downstream to cross the Koropieck River and strike the Old Town sector, a flank defended mainly by foreign-trained musketeers. These were professional soldiers drilled in Western volley fire. And when the Tatars came rushing in, they met rhythm and precision. Rank after rank fired in unbroken waves, one line shooting while the next reloaded, until the entire field echoed with a choking wall of smoke and musket fire. Once again, Polish cavalry rode in at the critical moment, driving the attackers back across the river. Still, the most dangerous crisis was yet to come. A sudden Tatar thrust hit the Polish supply camp behind the main lines. They caught the defenders off guard. Smoke rose, soldiers shouted in panic, and for a few terrifying minutes the entire Polish army seemed on the verge of collapse. And then the Tatars made the fatal mistake that exposed the deepest flaw in their entire military system. Instead of pressing the attack and smashing through to the main Polish force, many Tatar riders broke formation and began looting the camp. Their entire military culture had been built around Jazer, capturing wealth and people. The moment the promise of plunder appeared, discipline crumbled. What could have been a decisive breakthrough turned into chaos. As the Tatars rummaged for loot and dragged civilians away, the Poles rallied. Officers regained control. Artillery crews wheeled their guns into new firing positions. Infantry reformed their lines. The counterattack swept forward and, after a vicious fight, drove the Tatars out of the camp with heavy losses. By then, the Tatar army's momentum was gone. Its morale was broken. Kaplan-Giri, realizing every major assault had failed, ordered a withdrawal the next day. The battle reports that followed were predictably messy. Every faction had its own agenda. Polish losses ranged from 100 to 650 men, depending on the source. Tatar casualties swing wildly, from 200 to 6,000. That 30-fold difference says more about diplomatic posturing than battlefield truth. Polish envoys wanted to show Europe and the Ottomans that they had won a resounding victory as the Karlowitz negotiations wrapped up. But even the cautious estimates tell the same story. The Tatars suffered more casualties and their raid failed. And with that failure, the Ottomans and Crimean Tatars lost their last ounce of leverage. Had the raid succeeded, they might have demanded harsher terms over frontier regions like Podolia. Instead, the Commonwealth walked into the negotiations with renewed confidence and a fresh victory to point to. Yet the win exposed a painful truth about the Polish-Lithuanian military. Yes, they had mastered Western defensive warfare, gunpowder, entrenchments, disciplined infantry, and the mighty Tabor wagon fort. But in modernizing, they had sacrificed something that once defined them, light cavalry. By the late 17th century, reforms had shrunk the Polish light horse to barely 20% of the army. Against a steppe army of 30,000 mounted Tatars, that was like running a relay race without sprinters. So when the Tatars finally broke and fled, the Poles lacked the mounted strength to pursue. No pursuit meant no destruction of the retreating enemy, and, most tragically, no chance of rescuing the thousands of captives already taken. Many families would never see their loved ones again. The victory was real, but it came too late to undo that part of the tragedy. And here lies the strategic paradox. Poland had modernized brilliantly for defense, trenches, firepower, artillery discipline. But in doing so, it had given up the mobility needed to kill the raiding system at its roots. The Poles could stop a raid. They could not destroy the Jaeger, the slave-raiding engine that had plagued the frontier for centuries. That's why, in the months that followed, Polish leaders pushed for something lasting, a diplomatic wall where cavalry could not reach. Which brings us to one of the most consequential peace settlements in early modern Europe. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed January 26, 1699. It marked the formal end of Ottoman expansion into Europe, a decline that had begun at Vienna in 1683 and reshaped the map of Central and Eastern Europe. For the Holy League, Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia, it was the long-awaited reward after years of brutal conflict with the Ottomans. The treaty forced the empire to return Podolia, including the great fortress of Kamieniec-Podilskyi, whose fall in 1672 had been a national catastrophe for Poland. Recovering it meant the Commonwealth had finally achieved its primary war aim. Potocki's victory at Podhajce had given Poland what it needed most at the negotiation table: proof of control, proof that the Commonwealth could defend its borders even as empires carved up the Ottoman world. But treaties reshape more than borders. They rearrange rivalries. The weakening of Ottoman power opened space for two giants to compete: the Habsburgs and the Russian Tsars. Their struggle for influence around the Balkans, the Black Sea, and the remnants of Ottoman territory would simmer for more than a century, later known as the Eastern Question, a slow contest over who would inherit the Sultan's declining realms. And that is why Podhajce, 1698, though overshadowed by Vienna or Zinta, holds a quiet but crucial place in history. It was the final confirmation that Poland's frontier was secure, that its armies could still stand firm in a war dominated by giants. It also proved something subtler. Modernization worked, even if imperfectly. Potocki represented a new type of commander, less obsessed with the old romance of cavalry charges, more focused on disciplined, combined arms warfare. His victory showed that by the end of the 17th century, success belonged not to those who charged the fastest, but to those who could turn the battlefield itself into a weapon. The old world of pure cavalry thunder was fading. The new world of muskets, artillery, trenches, and coordination had arrived. And at Podhajce, the Commonwealth used those tools to end a centuries-old threat once and for all.